There is a mountain of new evidence and brand new reporting today that undercuts the original lie told by Donald Trump and his cabinet in the wake of the shooting death of Renee Nicole Good, that she was somehow threatening the life of the ICE agent who killed her. That lie has been used by the Trump administration to justify a surge of federal agents, more agents being sent to Minneapolis, and ever-increasing brutality being used against Americans and immigrants alike. A comprehensive analysis of currently available video footage by the New York Times shows that the ICE agent who killed Renee Nicole Good was not being run over, as Donald Trump and others have claimed. Watch.
This moment is when Agent Ross fires. We see the other agent pull back from the SUV. Both of them stumble, apparently slipping on the ice. This is also the moment many have said looks like Agent Ross getting run over. And it does when watched at full speed. But looking more closely, we can see in multiple angles that there's a visible gap between the vehicle and his legs, indicating his feet are positioned outside the SUV's path. The agent's left hand is still against the vehicle and gripping his phone. We see as he fires, it's recording the clouds and the trees overhead. It's not because the agent is knocked to the ground. The other angle shows he's still standing, continuing to maintain his grip on his phone and his gun, and we see a clear and growing gap between his body and the SUV as he fires a second shot and a third.
The New York Times also reports and concludes that it was indeed Good's killer who made the now infamous comments after shooting her.
According to our analysis of audio from Agent Ross's cell phone video, this is his reaction.
Good.
This is the F word followed by the B word. A reminder, Donald Trump said that Good ran over the ICE officer who shot her. Vance said that she aimed her car at the officer. DHS Secretary Kristi Noem, wearing a cowboy hat, called her a domestic terrorist. All of that now flies in the face of all of the evidence and everything that anyone can see with their own eyes and ears. Transcripts of the 911 calls were also released last night. They capture the shock that firsthand eyewitnesses expressed and felt and shared with 911 operators in the immediate aftermath of the shooting. A sense of panic and a sense of fear for their own lives and the safety and well-being of their children jumps out from these transcripts. One caller says this to a 911 operator, quote, "A bunch of ICE agents on 33rd and Portland, they just shot a lady point blank range in her car." When the operator asks, "How many are there?" he responds, quote, "There's 15 ICE agents and they shot her, like, because she wouldn't open her car door." Just before hanging up, he says this, quote, "Send an ambulance, please. Ambulance, please." Another caller to 911 tells a 911 operator this, "ICE just shot someone on Portland between 33rd and 34th, shot an observer in her car and it crashed," end quote. The 911 operator responds by saying, quote, "Okay, somebody else just called us and, well, can you see the person who shot at all?" The caller responds, "I'm sorry, I had to walk away because I have young kids and ICE is everywhere over there. But the person who was shot, you can see the car ended up crashing, so I don't think they're okay," end quote. New details and brand new evidence about the shooting death of Renee Nicole Good and what it says about the Trump administration's gaslighting of Americans is where we start today. Senior contributing editor and Minneapolis native Michelle Norris is back with us. Also joining us, former DHS Chief of Staff during Donald Trump's first term as president, Miles Taylor is here, and former senior advisor to President Biden and Vice President Harris, the former mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu's here. He's now the co-chair of American Bridge 21st Century. Michelle Norris, as we've done so many days since this happened, we turn to you for your reaction to the new evidence being made public today.
Well, it paints an ever more vivid picture and an ever more gruesome picture of what happened there in the 3400 block of Portland Avenue. One of the things that I think that we should be looking for is also the communication between the ICE officials and local police, because I wonder if they reached out to local police, to sheriffs, to someone, to EMTs, to get them on the scene. The language there certainly does not comport with the hasty conclusions that were made by the administration and shared with the public long before anybody had a chance to investigate this. There are so many questions about protocol here, about how quickly the car was taken away, about how quickly her body was taken away, about, in normal investigations, when you talk to law enforcement officials, normally what they do is they would separate everybody who was there on scene to make sure that that they could take testimony and that no one could collude and get together and get their story straight. None of those traditional protocols were handled. And so that's what happened in the 3400 block. What we're seeing now in the days after that is what has flowed from this in the state of where people feel like they're living in a state of terror and under a state of siege. It's also been reported today that there were, on Wednesday night, when there was that shooting on the north side of the city, there were some children that were taken to the hospital because they were in a van with their parents. The parents were trying to turn around and get away from the crowds that had gathered there. And you remember the pictures from that evening. There were chemical irritants that were used. The pepper pellets were used. And one of those flashbangs was emitted in the direction of the car, and there were several children in the car, and a couple of them had to go to the hospital, including a 6-month-old child who lost consciousness and stopped breathing for a time because of the chemical irritants that were in the air. DHS said that they were actually the victims of, and I want to get this right, rioters and agitators, and not the immigration enforcement agents. And they were saying if it were not for the people who showed up to observe or to protest, they wouldn't have had to use the flashbangs. But that's but one example of the kind of terror that's gripping the city, where children are wondering where their parents are. Some of the schools have been closed. We've talked about this. There's a lot of online learning because people are afraid to send their kids to school. Businesses are closing. People are afraid to go to work. And also, we learned this afternoon that DHS has subpoenaed the personal information for employees of the Hennepin County healthcare system. That's a huge healthcare system. And they've subpoenaed that so they can get their home addresses, their social security numbers, and their employment eligibility. And this is an example of how this affects everyone, because it's not just the immigrants who work or the suspected immigrants or people who are thought not to be citizens. Everyone who works in that medical system had their information subpoenaed, and people don't feel comfortable about this. So this is something that is affecting the entire area of the Twin Cities in the state of Minnesota.
Why are they seeking all the personal information of everyone in the healthcare system?
To check employment eligibility. I mean, it is thought that there are several people who are working in healthcare who might have immigration status and might not have legal immigration status. And it's a way that they can, check their eligibility. Oddly, I was talking to an attorney about this, and he said that they're uncomfortable with them seeking the information, but they do prefer that they actually look at information as opposed to doing the indiscriminate sweeps that seem to be happening elsewhere in the city, where they appear to be just approaching people who are commuting, who are on their way to work, who are on their way to school. He said, at least in that case, they're at least looking for information to figure out someone's eligibility without, before just indiscriminately targeting them.
Michelle, who is protecting the civilian population of Minnesota right now?
This is a really difficult question that the police department is dealing with, that lawyers are dealing with. If you remember the images from Wednesday night, it was immigration officials that were doing crowd control. And that's not something that immigration officials do. I was talking to someone who works in law enforcement in the Twin Cities at that time. And, when they were looking at these images, he was wondering how many of those people on the ground have actually had training in crowd control. How many of them actually understand how to de-escalate situations like this? So, that raises one question about, are they there to protect and to serve people? Have they been trained, in how to do this? There are a group of lawyers that met this afternoon, convened by the former Associate Justice of the Minnesota, actually not convened by, but it was a, let me get this straight. It was a conversation that was moderated by a former Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, very high-ranking person, someone who is very well respected, attorneys from big firms, corporate attorneys, a very large number of lawyers coming together and trying to figure out what's happening when the rule of law appears to be so fuzzy right now, and figuring out there will be a lot of lawsuits that flow from this, but also just figuring out who is there to protect the people, who is there to protect the guardrails around American democracy and the rule of law. And there have been so many lines that have been crossed, and so many protocols that have been completely ignored or warped in some way, that the people of Minnesota in government and in the legal system are trying to figure out how to move forward in this, and not just let this completely melt away, but figure out how to establish some sort of guardrails around the rule of law so that citizens are protected.
Every step this administration has taken after the death of Renee Good has been to blame the residents of Minnesota, blame the leaders in Minnesota and in Minneapolis, and to excuse and to send a signal to its agents on the ground that they can act however they want to. I think there was a term used, that they had absolute immunity. That term doesn't exist in the law, and they don't have absolute immunity. But like you said, the cruelty, yes, it is the point. But I'd like to remind everyone watching, what were those law enforcement officers doing, eating and then arresting, these people working the restaurant? If that doesn't show a lack of urgency around their supposed mission, I don't know what else would, right? If you're really trying to execute an immigration enforcement action, you're not going to casually eat in a restaurant and then go and approach your targets. This is just unheard of. This isn't immigration enforcement. It's not law enforcement. It's political intimidation. And I'm going to keep saying this. The president has weaponized the Department of Homeland Security and federal law enforcement to act as his own federal police force. If we don't name that for what it is, we'll keep falling into this trap of thinking that this is just an immigration issue. It's actually a constitutional issue about state police power versus federal police power. And there's not supposed to be this type of federal police power.
Can I just ask a question? I want to stay on that point for a second, Tim, because arrest them for what? Did they have a subpoena? Had they identified the workers in that restaurant as gang members or as felons, or as individuals who are engaged in other illegal activity in this country, maybe belonging to a gang? You sat your ass down at their restaurant and ate their food. And then you come back with what? Where were the warrants? When you looked at that server in the face, did you know, oh, there's a criminal, let me go check some database because I recognize them from some other investigation? This is, it's not just the cruelty is the point. It is just the sheer insanity that they think the rest of us are deaf, dumb, and stupid to what they're doing. I just don't understand how that happens, Tim. I mean, I've listened to you, and just sort of just put the right finger on the pulse here about what this really is in this moment.
Well, it's political, right? Like, this is a political effort, and it's also performative, right? It's politics and it's performance. It's not public safety. That's not what they're doing. They're saying that they're here to go after the worst, and they barely even pay lip service to that anymore. If they wanted to, figure out a way to just go after the worst people that have committed crimes here, they'd do what you're saying. They'd go get a warrant, right? If they wanted to deport the most people, but with the least disruption to communities, right, where there was no performance in it, what they would do is they would go to the big donors, right? They would go to the owners of, construction companies and agricultural plants, and they'd say, sorry, we can't, we need to come look at your employment records and go that way. But they don't want to do that because they don't want to anger, big supporters of the president. Mm-hmm. So instead what they're doing is this, they're going into these neighborhoods, they're going into the communities, they're menacing people. They want to scare people, and they also want to escalate. This Tim Walz Fry DOJ effort is an effort to escalate, right? They want a response so they can crack down harder. That's what they're doing. It's politics and performance, and it's an effort to try to gain more authoritarian power for themselves. And that's why they're going about it this way. And I think it's just important to be blunt about that.
That is, in fact, the point, Andrea. I agree with Tim. Look, I I have to tell you, I'm struggling to see what it is going to take for the Republicans on Capitol Hill are a lost cause to me. I'm not going to wait for them. But some of the business leaders that know they have the president's ear, what is it going to take for people to speak up? Because as Governor Walz laid out, first it was, we have all these examples of people that the government has targeted. But this one, obstructed justice for what? How so? In what way, shape, or form? I just think of this James Baldwin quote. He warned us that the great danger is not that people don't see what's happening. It's that they are taught to accept it. If the business community, if lay people in the streets of this country who have been speaking up, but if the business community and other leaders in this country, educational leaders, leaders at law firms who have been willing to stand up to Trump on other things, some of them not so much, but there are some bright spots out there, and I'm not just talking about Mark Elias. People have to stand up because we are not on a slippery slope to authoritarianism, baby. We are living in the opening act of Donald Trump's version of an authoritarian America, and that is not hyperbolic. The photos from Minneapolis to Chicago to right here in Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, they paint the picture and they tell the story.
That's right. I mean, what does every authoritarian leader need? They need their own federal police force. They need their own kind of law enforcement agents that they can direct. We have that. And let's be really clear. Since the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, there was a fear that ICE and Border Patrol, because I hear a lot about ICE, I don't hear about Border Patrol, that these officers were overfunded, that they were not professionalized. And I have worked into 2 Democratic administrations where they have resisted basic use of force policies, basic trainings, because we were afraid to say we need to hold immigration enforcement accountable. President Trump knows exactly what he's doing with these agencies. He found 2 of the biggest law enforcement agencies, not just in the country, but really in the world. And he said, all right, I'm going to deploy them against the city, and he's letting them be free. Some of the people we see doing the most harm have worked at these agencies for decades under multiple administrations.
Like the officer who shot and killed Renee Good. He was a 10-year veteran of ICE.
A 10-year veteran. So ask, what is that culture where it just took 1 year for him to use force in that way and to adopt tactics? He got that tactic from the Border Patrol, which he served in. But all I hear right now is ICE, ICE, ICE. I want to hear about Border Patrol, about Bureau of Prisons, about the fact that Trump has taken every federal agent and sent them into the front lines to replace local police with a federal police force. That is unconstitutional in and of itself. And to your point about Governor Walz and Mayor Frey, they're saying something really important. They're saying, film what you're seeing. If we hadn't seen that video of Renee Good, if we didn't read the story about a family of 6 being tear gassed, if we didn't read about that Mexican restaurant, what is Trump getting away with if we don't see that? And then what is the opposition party going to do? Because you can't just say quick things like abolish ICE or reform certain. This is a system that's been weaponized, and I don't know how we're coming back from it without a clearer vision going forward of right-sizing immigration enforcement and offering a real alternative that Americans can choose in the elections. Because we can be against this, but those agencies will continue on, those officers will continue on, and that legacy and that emboldening of what will keep happening.
Tim, right now we're talking about blue cities and blue states, but there are rumors swirling in Central Florida that there's about to be a big ICE operation there. When it comes to DeSantis's backyard, when it comes to Abbott's backyard, when all of a sudden it's the ag folks in their states saying, hi, you're decimating our workforce, or the construction industry that's saying we can't build homes without these workers. Does he listen to them?
Potentially. I mean, we've seen him talk on some of the stuff, particularly with related to the farm workers and the hospitality workers, since that's his business. He's employed plenty of undocumented immigrants over the years. But all that stuff takes time. You can do a lot of damage in the interim, right? So he already's done this in my home state, Louisiana, right? Like they sent a bunch of troops in. Bavino was there, a little 4'11" center for, the Border Patrol guy. He's marching around the French Quarter. And it had a real impact. It really did. I have friends who are in the construction business saying people weren't showing up to work, even people who were illegal because they didn't want to be hassled, right? It had a negative impact economically in the state. This is kind of weird to say luckily, but unfortunately for Louisiana, Like they moved all those folks to Minneapolis when this stuff exploded in Minneapolis, and now everybody says, look, everybody's back to work, right? So they can go into Florida and Texas, create a ruckus, get a scene, get the images for TV that they want, scare people, and then leave kind of before I think that pushback happens. Especially when you just see the evidence that, like, look, these business leaders have not had any backbone when it comes to pushing back to them.
Is there really that much of an uprising underneath the surface regarding Greenland?
I mean, look, Katie, one of the themes of the Trump administration, both the first term and now this one, is how far can the president go until he draws that criticism from Republicans? What is too far for Republicans up on Capitol Hill? What can they tolerate? It seems like one of those things that may be a bridge too far and intolerable for those GOP lawmakers is this rhetoric about Greenland. The president and the White House saying that all options are on the table when it comes to Greenland, including military intervention, is really causing concern among Republicans by and large. And you mentioned Don Bacon. He's been one of the loudest critics of this conversation and this floating, saying as recently as this week to a local outlet that if the president were to go forward with military intervention to take control of Greenland, it would be impeachable. And he believes that a large number of Republicans would follow him in that right. So certainly this is something that, of all the conversation we've had about President Trump drawing concerns from Republicans, wondering if it's a bridge too far for them to be comfortable with, the Greenland conversation, it seems like, has been in that territory. Now, I say it seems like because, of course, with the Republicans on Capitol Hill, you don't give them credit for going against the president until it actually happens. Case in point being this conversation and this situation involving the Venezuela War Powers Resolution. We saw 5 of those Republicans break ranks and vote to advance that War Powers Resolution. But a week later, after a heavy lobbying campaign from the White House, 2 of them flipped and essentially killed that effort. So we would have to see how a conversation about Greenland and the repercussions would take place if there were something like military intervention in the country. But certainly Republicans, led by, as you mentioned, Don Bacon, are making it very clear that would be a massive problem for them.
Yeah, no, what's interesting about this, and David, you write this, is whether that line shifts. And often before that line starts to shift, we see lawmakers, Republican lawmakers, try to interpret what Donald Trump really means, to try to say, oh, he might be saying that, but what he really intends is this. And we've been hearing that again from lawmakers today. You read all about it. You say this: Trump knows what he's saying and knows what he's doing or what he wants to do. When he speaks and when he acts, it's with deliberate intent. Congressional Republicans who oppose an American invasion of Greenland might want to ponder that rather than soothe themselves with fantasies that Trump's tough talk is about, quote, leverage.
Yeah, well, I think, Katie, when you look at the second term, and we're just about a year in, I think it's pretty clear that the president does what he says he's going to do. And when he's talking about something, it's not just conceptual. It's not just about poking the bear. I think in the first presidency, it was defensible for Republicans to presume that Trump didn't totally understand the ramifications of things that he would talk about. He was often advised against doing things that he wanted. So in retrospect, I think he should have been taken seriously then. He clearly needs to be taken seriously in the second presidency. But Republicans are caught in this box of disagreeing with President Trump, but not wanting to publicly disagree with him. And so they try to send these subtle signals to the president to back off, to look at something differently. And most of the time, it doesn't work. It works occasionally. I think we also need to point out here, and I'm sure you're going to get into this, that the president's claim that we need to acquire Greenland or China and Russia will are specious. Republicans understand this, at least Republicans on the Hill, and they're specious because Greenland is owned by Denmark. Denmark is a part of NATO. Russia and China are not going to make a move against a NATO territory. It would trigger Article 5 and potentially a huge conflagration. And so this whole idea that we can't use existing agreements to proliferate more military bases on Greenland to do the things the president wants to do is just not true. And so it's another reason, I think, why the president should be taken seriously here, because he's so far proven that he does not back down, even in the face of criticism and falling poll numbers.
I'm so happy you brought that up because I was thinking about that very thing this morning, that the idea that we have to have it to deter China and Russia, and we're the only ones that can defend Greenland. It is a NATO country. It would be like Russia or China going after the UK or going after France or Poland. I mean, there is a reason why NATO exists. NATO is a collective of security between a number of nations. So it is as if we do own Greenland. On that note, and as you are there, you've been speaking to people. I mentioned at the top that people are taking this seriously. Tell me more about what you're hearing and what you're hearing from lawmakers in the territory.
Yeah, they're still worried, Katie. They're also waiting to see what happens next. I will say in recent days, we have been seeing this military buildup here in Greenland as the Danes and European allies ramp up their military presence here in Greenland and around the island. People here have been telling me that they find that reassuring. They're grateful that the Europeans are sending in reinforcements. At the same time, there's something a little bit bizarre about seeing these, Danish Navy ships around Nuuk, or we saw Danish C-130s landing at the airport last night. This is such a peaceful, remote part of the world, and I think it's part of what people love about living in Greenland is that they feel they're kind of isolated from the rest of the madness happening around the world. So there is something a little bit bizarre about seeing these ships and planes here in Greenland. We were at the airport watching one of those planes land last night. I asked some people who had gathered there to watch the plane's arrival what they thought about military buildup in their country. I'll let you listen to what one woman had to say.
Now he's talking about it's not only for the security, he just wants the country, but we're not for sale. So that's our main goal, to explain that we are still people, really real people living here, and we want to be respected for that.
And she went on to say that she thinks this might be more about Greenland's vast, largely untapped natural resources. And we are expecting Greenlanders to make their voices heard tomorrow. There are 2 big demonstrations planned, one in Copenhagen outside the U.S. Embassy and one here in Nuuk outside the U.S. consulate, Katie.
All right, let me play Von Hilliard, who just spoke with the president, asked him about NATO and whether he would feel comfortable attacking NATO.
Mr. President, do you commit to not militarily engaging NATO partners?
I don't talk about that.
Mr. President, you're not willing to commit to not attacking a NATO partner?
You urge protesters.
Commit is a better word here. He's asking the president, will he commit to not attacking our allies? And the president, ambassador, says, I don't talk about that. What?
What do you say, Katie? Honestly, what do you say at this point? I mean, this is such an extraordinary time. I am happy to see folks, in particular Republican members of Congress, start to speak out about this. Frankly, I wish that they had done it a year ago when he first made his threats vis-a-vis Greenland. I can tell you this, that whether or not Americans take these threats seriously, whether or not Republican members of Congress do, our great friends in Denmark and Greenland do. They take it extraordinarily seriously. So it is unthinkable that during our lifetimes, the President of the United States would not take military engagement against a NATO ally who has fought and died alongside us for the last 80 years. It's extraordinary that a U.S. president won't take that off the table.
So what could he do in Greenland by owning it that he can't do currently in Greenland, being a part of the alliance?
Absolutely nothing, Katie, is the answer to the question. So, and this is what drives me crazy about it, because the goals that they articulate, the national security goals and the economic goals, are achievable today. As David mentioned, we used to have 17 military bases on Greenland. It was the U.S., it was our administrations, Republican and Democrats alike, including Trump 1, who made a decision not to reinvest in Greenland, which we could do. And we have a treaty dating back to 1951 that would allow us to do that. In addition to that, there are existing relationships that we have with bilaterally, but with Greenland, that would allow us to go and mine for rare earth minerals. You know who would love that more than anybody anybody else? The Danes and the Greenlanders. So these justifications are just bogus. They don't make sense. And it's very clear. To me, it's very clear. So it is hard.
Is there something else that we're missing here? I mean, if the U.S. owned Greenland and wanted to mine it for its resources, are there limits to mining it for its resources? Limits to what we can put on the island? Are there limits that Donald Trump wants to be able to blow through that he believes he'll be able to do by owning it? I mean, I'm trying to figure out something other than Donald Trump likes how big it is on a map and wants to put his name on it.
Well, I have probably little doubt that processes associated with mining could get easier if you remove all, say, environmental protections and environmental regulations and whatnot were the U.S. to own it. I suppose that's possible and maybe even logical. That being said, this can all get done. I mean, all you got to do is sit across the table from one of our best allies in the world, in Denmark and Greenland, and they would gladly make that deal. That's what they tried to do at the White House 2 days ago, and I don't think they got very far. I also want to say one thing. David made the case about national security. I would take it one step further, that actually this weakens American national security, that the idea of weakening NATO, all that does is empower our adversaries in Russia and China. I think this idea actually makes the United States weaker, not stronger.
Trump vowed to lower prices, but these new polls that show skepticism against his first year include huge concern over the economy. Trump's advice has been buy fewer dolls.
You don't need 37 dolls for your daughter. 2 or 3 is nice.
We may have short-term a little pain, and people understand that.
Maybe the children will have 2 dolls instead of 30 dolls, you know? And maybe the 2 dolls will cost a couple of bucks more than they would normally.
Many say this is let them eat cake territory. Voters heard a Trump official tell everyone, just try $3 meals.
We've run over 1,000 simulations. It can cost around $3 a meal for a piece of chicken, a piece of broccoli, corn tortilla, and one other thing. And so there is a way to do this that actually will save the average American consumer money.
The whole thing is drawing widespread ridicule. Nobody really thinks the stuff you see on your screen is a full meal for $3. And critics say Trump's gone full Jimmy Carter, a Democrat who memorably and infamously told people who couldn't afford their heating bills, well, try a cardigan like the one he wore in a now infamous address to the nation. Turning to a different lens on the great uprising across America, this is a bit different than what you're hearing in Washington or even from a lot of Democratic Trump critics, because millions of voters are coming together. And it's not just against the overreach of the Trump administration, which we covered earlier tonight, but this record-breaking high, 45% of Americans identify as independents. You can see that surge on the gray line up there. It is more popular by a lot to say you're an independent, to look for an independent approach to politics right now than either party. And a famous independent, Minnesota's Governor Jesse Ventura, who actually won without either major party, has been speaking out.
Freedom is not arresting people without warrants. We have a system here. It's called a Constitution. And we have a party, the Republicans, who don't seem to want to abide by the Constitution.
A strong attack from a credible source, not someone who's just against Republicans for political reason, but calling out that constitutional problem. Now, if you dig into the surveys, right now a lot of independents are leaning more left or Democratic than Republican. And that has helped the Democrats get an edge for the first time in years, which could help them in the midterms. But remember, our system cuts out a lot of the independent energy. There's actually only 2 major independent lawmakers from New England, King and Sanders. You probably know about them. And they've been on the same page against MAGA.
The people who are cheering this on, I fear, in a reasonably short period of time, are going to say, where did this go? How did this happen? How did we make our president into a monarch?
President Trump, we don't want you or any other king to rule us.
This is a constitutional crisis. It's the most serious assault on our Constitution in the history of this country.
We will not move toward authoritarianism in America. We, the people, will rule.
Those independents in Congress are against Trump. A lot of the independents and the surge we see are clearly against what's happening in the country, against the incumbent Trump administration. The big exception here to anyone thinking, oh, well, that's more anti-Trump energy is they have an option to go to the Democrats. They're not doing that. So we are witnessing something larger, either because both parties have been discredited or perhaps a problem in the Democrats just trying to catch the anti-Trump energy rather than offering something to these disaffected voters that might make them Democrats again. We want to go to a special guest on this. Linda Killian is a historian and the author of the book, The Swing Vote, The Untapped Power of Independence. Welcome. Happy Friday. How are you?
Fine. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. This is kind of your thing. And here we have data suggesting more independence than ever, which is clearly dissatisfaction with Trump. I mentioned that. But also not running to the alternative in the formal two-party system. Explain.
That's exactly right. What's driving this is high dissatisfaction with both parties. Independents haven't felt the parties are listening to them, don't care about the things they care about for a long time, and they don't feel well represented by the political system. They believe incompetence and corruption are present in both parties, that the political system is run by the super rich and the game is rigged. Young people especially feel this way. And the Gallup poll showed that now even more than ever, they're identifying as independents. Older voters have become used to the two-party system, but younger voters who have so much choice in every other area of their lives are not as wedded to just being two parties. They would like more legitimate choices. But as you mentioned, the system is rigged against independent candidates who don't have the same opportunities for ballot access, fundraising, campaign organization. Independents see Trump messing around in foreign entanglements, talking about taking over Greenland, which 3/4 of all Americans oppose, imposing tariffs, which have only raised prices, arresting their friends, neighbors, employees, invading cities, and they don't like it. They want to know what political leaders, both Democrats and Republicans, are going to do about their cost of living and health care, things that affect their lives.
And you mentioned the shift in age, voters under 30, majority saying no thanks to both parties. They're online more, and I want to show some of what we're hearing on TikTok from a range of ages, but people sort of voicing this same thing we're seeing in the data. Take a look.
I'm a registered independent.
I've been an independent since I was able to vote, but this January I finally registered as a Democrat.
Where is the third party pushing in local elections?
I think I'm independent. I don't want to be a part of neither one.
If you want to be taken seriously, you've got to build something.
What is your political party?
Independent. I was brought up conservative and Republican.
Typically vote much more Democratic than I vote Republican. I used to vote primarily Republican.
Linda, how do we make sense of this obvious mismatch? If you're watching the news and you're covering Congress, you're covering the two-party system, and it's relevant because they're in charge, both parties, depending on the time period. But when 45% of the country says, no, I don't want to pick among those two, and yet the discourse, and I would admit, including here on the news sometimes, is those two debating. So one side says, oh, you're too woke, we hate that. And the other side says, you're bigoted. And that's sort of this loop. And maybe 45% of the country is going, we got other things to talk about as well.
Well, the system, the ball is in the Democrats' court, is what I would say, because the system is very difficult for independent candidates, and independent voters only have to choose mostly between Republicans and Democrats. And one thing that the Gallup poll showed is that we now have this large number of Democratic leaners among the independents, more than has been in the past. Now, 45% of political independents call themselves that group, 20% are Democratic leaners. Only 15% are Republican leaders. 10% are the true swing voters. And so the Democrats did well last year in elections, but they've got to bring a message that will resonate with these voters. They can't just, wing it. They can't just phone it in. And they're hoping for a midterm on steroids. Some people may remember, I know you do, Ari, the 1994 election when Republicans won both the House and Senate in the middle of Bill Clinton's term. I wrote a book about that called The Freshman. Now with extreme gerrymandering, that kind of swing is almost impossible. So the Democrats have their work cut out for them. Typically, independent voters break decisively.
Yeah. No, and I get what you're saying. It's really interesting. And Linda, this is your beat, and it's as relevant as ever.